Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and I want to open with a sentence that I would have rolled my eyes at a few years ago. The story you tell about your life may show up in your blood work. I know. I hear it too. That sentence lives in a bad neighborhood right next door to crystal healing and the idea that you can think your tumor away. And I want to be extremely clear before we take a single step further. That is not what this episode is. I have no patience for the version of this that tells sick people they got sick because they weren't positive enough. That's not science and it's cruel. But underneath the nonsense, there's a real body of research, and it's more interesting and more careful than the wellness version. It doesn't say that meaning overrides biology. It says something more precise. It says that meaning gets implemented in biology through specific traceable pathways and that we can now follow the route. So that's our stride today. First, the mechanism, and I mean the actual mechanism, how something as vaporous as an interpretation turns into something as concrete as a hormone. Then the pathways, because meaning does not become one molecule, it becomes something much more like a policy. Then the clearest proof we have, which is a phenomenon everyone has heard of and almost nobody has thought hard enough about. Then the shadow side, how a story can wear a groove into a body over years. Then the hopeful side, and one finding about therapy that stopped me in my tracks. And finally, the honest limits, because that's what separates this from the stuff I just told you I have no patience for. Let's take the first step. Start with the puzzle in its sharpest form. Meaning is abstract, it has no mass. Your interpretation of a phone call from your mother does not weigh anything, and yet your interpretation of that phone call can raise your cortisol, tighten your gut, and change how your immune cells behave over the next hour. How? By what possible route does a thought about what something means reach your inflammatory markers? The answer the research gives is elegant, and it starts with something called a self in context model. Here's what that means in plain language. Your brain is constantly building a compressed working picture of what's happening, one that folds together the sensory information coming in, the signals from inside your body, your memories, your goals, and your sense of who you are. Not just a phone is ringing, something more like, my mother is calling, and the last 3 times she called it was bad news, and I don't have the capacity for this today. That picture is the meaning. And it isn't a passive summary, it's a working model, and the brain uses it to decide what to do with your body. The circuitry keeps pointing to the same places, a region called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which sits behind your forehead and is deeply involved in the self, in value, and in what things mean to you specifically. The anterior cingulate cortex, which learns what to expect in a given context and recruits control accordingly, and the insula, which is the great interpreter of bodily feeling, the place where the state of your guts and the state of your thoughts get read against each other. And here's the key architectural fact: these regions are not sealed off in some philosophical compartment. They have roots, direct and indirect, down into the machinery that runs your body. They project into the hypothalamus, into the brainstem, into the circuits that govern your stress hormones and your autonomic nervous system, the automatic controller of your heart rate and your gut and your breath. So the appraisal isn't just registered, it's transmitted. The meaning has an address, and the address is your body. Now let's follow where it goes, because this is where I found the research genuinely thrilling. The first pathway is endocrine, which is the hormone route. Your appraisal circuits reach the hypothalamus, which triggers a cascade down through the pituitary and the adrenal glands, ending in cortisol. That's the HPA axis, and it's the one most people have heard of. What you interpret as threatening gets converted within seconds to minutes into a chemical that reorganizes your metabolism, your immune function, and your attention. The second is autonomic, which is the wiring route. Networks spanning the medial prefrontal cortex, the cingulate, the insula, the amygdala, and the brainstem shift the balance between your sympathetic system, which mobilizes you, and your parasympathetic system, which settles you. That's your heart rate, your blood pressure, your arousal. Activity in that ventromedial prefrontal region has been found to co-vary with heart rate variability, blood pressure, and skin conductance. Your interpretation is quite literally in your pulse. The third is the vagus nerve, and it's my favorite because it runs in both directions. The vagus is a great wandering cable from the brainstem down through the heart, the lungs, the gut. Its outgoing fibers regulate your organs and help put a brake on inflammation. Its incoming fibers carry news from your body and your immune system back up to the brain. It is a two-way conversation, not a command line. The fourth is immune. And this is the one that would have sounded like fantasy not that long ago. There are now well described neural, hormonal, and cellular pathways by which brain states influence immune activity. And immune cells carry receptors for the very neurotransmitters and neuropeptides the nervous system uses. Your immune system is listening to your nervous system. It has the receivers to do it. There's even work showing that brain circuits can sense inflammatory signals and modulate the production of immune cells in response. And the fifth is behavior, which we forget because it's not glamorous, but it may be the biggest of all. Your beliefs about what you can do and what matters and who you are determine whether you sleep, move, eat, drink, take the medication, go to the appointment, call the friend. Over years, that's an enormous biological force, and it's driven entirely by meaning. So put those together, and you get the sentence I'd underline in this whole episode. The brain does not convert meaning into one molecule. It converts meaning into a coordinated regulatory policy across the entire body. Your interpretation doesn't become a chemical, it becomes an instruction set, and the body executes it. I want to give you one study that makes this concrete in a way I can't shake. Researchers looked at people while they were doing cognitive reappraisal, which is the ordinary mental act of reinterpreting something upsetting so it hurts less. They measured brain activity in the anterior cingulate during that act. Then they measured a marker of inflammation in the blood, interleukin 6, and then they measured early preclinical atherosclerosis, which is the beginning of plaque in the arteries. All three were connected. The neural activity during emotion regulation was associated with the inflammatory marker, and the inflammatory marker appeared to mediate the link to the arterial disease. Sit with that chain for a second. How a person's brain handles the reinterpretation of an upsetting event connected through inflammation to the state of the walls of their arteries. I am being careful with my language here because that's a correlational finding and I won't pretend it proves cause. But it maps a plausible road, and the road runs from meaning to the heart, and it doesn't require anything mystical to travel it. Just nerves, hormones, and cells that have receptors for what nerves and hormones are saying. There's a related measure worth knowing about because you'll hear it everywhere once you notice it. Heart rate variability, the small natural fluctuation in the timing between your heartbeats. It's used as an index of vagal regulation, and it tends to track something the research links to a felt sense of safeness and social connection, which means the number is not just a fitness metric. It's closer to a readout of how safe your body currently believes it is. Your heart is keeping a running tally of your circumstances, and it's willing to tell you the score. Now, let me give you the cleanest demonstration we have, and it's something you've heard of your entire life and probably never sat with properly. The placebo effect. Think about what a placebo actually is. It's a substance with no active ingredient. Chemically, it's nothing. And it reliably produces measurable changes in symptoms, in pain, in physiology. So, what is doing the work, not the pill? The pill is inert. What's doing the work is the meaning of the pill, the expectation, the context, the white coat, the ritual, the belief that help has arrived. The research describes placebo as an effective appraisal process, meaning your brain forms a belief about your future well being, and that belief itself changes your body. It's not that you imagine feeling better, your physiology moves. And the circuitry involved is exactly the circuitry we've been talking about: the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the insula, the amygdala, running down into the brainstem and the body. A placebo is a pure experiment in meaning. It is the cleanest evidence we could ask for that an interpretation all by itself reaches into flesh. And its dark twin is the nocebo, where an expectation of harm produces real harm. Warn people about a side effect, and a meaningful number of them will develop it from a pill with nothing in it, which tells you the channel runs both ways with equal power. Meaning is not a nice thing that produces nice outcomes. Meaning is a lever, and levers move in both directions. There's a subtler version of this that I find even more useful for daily life, and it's the research on stress mindsets. Here's the setup. Two people face the same stressful situation. One believes stress is fundamentally damaging, something that erodes you, wears you down, shortens your life. The other believes stress can be useful, that the pounding heart and heightened alertness are the body mobilizing resources to meet a demand. The research finds these two people don't just feel differently. They cope differently, they show different somatic symptoms, and their performance and well being diverge. In adolescence, believing stress could be beneficial was associated with less distress after adverse events, and that buffered the decline in self control that stress otherwise produces. Same stressor, different meaning, different biology, and different life. And notice what that is not. It's not pretending you're fine. It's not calling a bad thing good. It's a genuinely accurate reading of an ambiguous signal. Your heart is pounding because your body is mobilizing. That's true. It happens to also be a reading that costs you less. Now, I have to take us into the shadow because if meaning can heal, it can also harm. And the research on that is where this stops being a feel good story. Researchers use a phrase for this, and it's a heavy one: biological embedding. It means that a meaning, repeated enough over a long enough time, stops being an event and becomes a structure. Here's the most sobering finding I encountered. Self and context processing shaped by adversity has been linked to a shift in the gene expression of your white blood cells, tilting them toward a pro inflammatory profile, and the root appears to run through the descending sympathetic nerves. Read that carefully. A person's ongoing interpretation of their circumstances, their felt sense of threat and social defeat, appears to be reaching down a nerve and changing what their immune cells are doing at the level of which genes are switched on. That is not a metaphor. That is a story becoming a molecule. And it explains something that has always frustrated me about how we talk about stress. We treat chronic stress as if it's a mood, a discomfort, something you should push through. The research treats it as a long running biological instruction, one that reallocates the body's energy toward short term survival at the expense of long term repair. Live under that instruction for years, and it starts wearing grooves. The depression research shows the same architecture from the inside. A predictive processing account of depression describes it as a self reinforcing loop, where negative beliefs about the self in the future become so heavily weighted that they resist updating and then go on to bias the interpretation of everything that follows. The world offers evidence that things could be otherwise, and the evidence doesn't land, and the model that predicted a bleak world quietly produces one. And there's an uncomfortable social dimension here that I refuse to skip past because it connects to an episode we did on whether self control is fair. Research has found socioeconomic disparities in how the stress hormone system is regulated and in the structure of the prefrontal cortex itself, which means the machinery we've been discussing, the machinery that converts meaning into biology, is not distributed evenly across the society. Poverty is not only a bank balance, it's a set of chronic meanings, and those meanings get implemented in bodies, and the implementation shows up in hormones and in tissue. That is not a fact about individual weakness. It's a fact about what an environment does to a person over years, running through the same pathways we've been tracing all episode. And here's the piece that I think demands compassion from all of us. Research on childhood maltreatment suggests it can harden these schemas, partly by reducing a person's exposure to the very evidence that would disconfirm them. Think about what that means practically. A child who learns that people are dangerous will, quite sensibly, avoid people. And in avoiding them, they never accumulate the experiences that would teach them otherwise. The belief protects itself by eliminating its own counter evidence. So when you meet an adult who cannot seem to trust or cannot accept that they're loved, and you find yourself thinking, why won't they just see it? This is the answer. It isn't stubbornness, it's a model that was installed for good reason and then sealed itself shut. But hold on, because this is exactly where the hope lives, and I want to give you the finding that stopped me in my tracks. There's a body of work on what's called narrative identity, which is essentially the internalized, evolving story you tell about who you are and how you got here. And researchers have found that some features of that story track very closely with well being. Themes of agency, of being an actor in your own life rather than a passive object of it, themes of redemption, where difficulty is metabolized into meaning rather than just endured. Now, that alone could just be correlation. Happy people tell happier stories. Fine, but here's the finding that lifts it out of correlation. In a longitudinal study of people going through psychotherapy, increases in narrative agency preceded improvements in mental health. The story changed first, not people got better and then described themselves as agents. The shift in how they narrated their own life came before the improvement in how they felt, which is at least strongly suggestive that the story is not a readout of the healing. It may be part of the machinery of it. And there's a related idea I keep coming back to from the research on identity and self regulation. Actions that feel identity relevant carry greater subjective value, which makes them easier to choose and to sustain. So, I am trying to quit smoking and I am not a smoker are not two ways of saying the same thing. The second one changes what the action is worth to the system that has to keep choosing it every day, forever. That's not a slogan, that's a change in the valuation. And valuation is what drives behavior, and behavior is what writes itself into your body over decades. There's more in this direction, and it's worth having. Take self efficacy, which is simply your belief that you can actually do the thing. That belief has been found to work alongside your goals and your expectations to shape motivation, behavior, and well being over time. In studies during the pandemic, higher self efficacy was associated with perceiving less threat, coping more actively, and reporting fewer mental health problems. And it's easy to hear that as a nice thought, so let me put it in the terms of this episode. A belief about your own capacity alters your appraisal of a threat, and appraisal is the front end of the whole cascade we've been following. Change the appraisal, and you have changed the input to your hormones, your autonomic tone, and every behavior you will or won't do this month. The belief is not sitting beside your biology, the belief is upstream of it. And then there's the finding I'd want to put on the wall of anybody who works in mental health. In work on narrative identity, the strongest links to well being come not from having a tidy or well structured story, but from motivational and meaning related themes, agency, purpose, the integration of hard experiences into something that means something. It isn't about being a good storyteller, it's about what the story is for. I want to be careful not to romanticize that because it can slide into the idea that suffering is a gift, which is a thing people say to the suffering and almost never about themselves. Difficulty is not a gift, but the research does suggest that what a person eventually does with a difficulty, whether it stays raw or becomes load bearing, is not fixed at the moment of the wound. And that leaves a door open that I think a lot of people don't know is there. The last piece is that none of this is solitary. Resilience research is clear that resilience is multisystemic, arising from biological, psychological, social, and ecological systems together, not from private mental toughness. One influential account describes resilience as resting on three things: plasticity, sociality, and meaning. Notice that sociality sits right in the middle of it. much of the meaning that regulates your biology is not manufactured alone in your head. It's built with other people, and it is sustained by them, and it can be repaired by them. So let me try to hold all of this together because there's a shape here. Your brain is constantly answering one question: what does this mean for me? Not abstractly, practically. What does this mean for my safety, my energy, my standing, my future? And the answer it lands on becomes a prediction, and predictions become bodily preparation, and bodily preparation repeated becomes physiology, and physiology sustained becomes health or illness. The question is asked thousands of times a day. You mostly don't hear it being asked, and you are living inside the accumulated answers. Now, the honest limits. And I want to spend real time here because everything I've said becomes dangerous without them. First and most important, meaning does not override biology. The same research that maps these pathways is emphatic that biological regulation also depends on things your interpretations have no vote in: circadian timing, hormones, metabolism, the microbiome, the specific programs your immune cells are running, genetics, infection, injury. The evidence supports meaning as an indirect brain mediated influence, not as a standalone molecular regulator. Which means, and I want to say this as plainly as I know how, nobody in this research is saying you can think your way out of a disease. Nobody is saying you got sick because of your attitude. If you are ill, this episode is not an accusation. Illness is not a verdict on the quality of your inner life, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Second, the effects are real, but they are modest and specific, not miraculous and global. A stress mindset shifts outcomes. It doesn't make you invulnerable. A placebo can genuinely reduce pain. It cannot regrow a limb. Precision matters here, and the moment we lose it, we've left science and entered fantasy. Third, and this is the one I think gets forgotten most, meaning is not distributed equally, and it is not simply chosen. Which meanings are available to a person is shaped by their circumstances, their culture, their resources, their history. Research on stress explicitly notes that what counts as a loss or a threat is partly determined by socially constructed environments. Telling a person in genuine deprivation to reframe their situation while changing nothing about the situation is not an intervention. It's an insult with a scientific accent. The meaning is real. The circumstances that generate it are also real. Anyone who uses this research to make suffering into a personal failing has understood exactly nothing. So, with all of that held, what do we actually do with this? Here's what I'd offer, and it's modest on purpose. Start by taking your interpretations seriously as physical events, not as thoughts you happen to be having floating somewhere above your life, but as inputs into a system that is going to act on them. When you decide that the meeting means they're going to fire you, that decision is not neutral. It's about to become cortisol. It's about to become a night of shallow sleep. It's about to become a slightly worse version of you tomorrow who will then interpret the next thing slightly worse. Interpretation compounds, which means the question, is this actually what it means, is not navel gazing, it's maintenance. Second, look for the ambiguous signals in your life because those are where the leverage is. Your body throws off states that don't come pre-labeled. The racing heart before the presentation, the heaviness on a Sunday, the tightness in your chest when the message arrives, those are raw signals waiting for a story. And what the research shows is that you have some say in which true story gets attached, not infinite say. Some. I'm falling apart and I'm mobilized can both be honest descriptions of the same adrenaline. One of them costs you less. Third, pay attention to agency in your own story because of that psychotherapy finding, not forced optimism. Agency. Where in this situation are you an actor rather than only a recipient? Even a small true answer to that question appears to matter, and it appears to matter before things get better rather than after. And fourth, remember that the story is not the only door. Everything we covered in the last episode still holds. You can enter through the body, you can enter through the environment. Meaning is one channel, and it's a powerful one, and it's still one of four. Here's what I most want you to carry out of this. The story you're telling yourself about your life is not decoration on top of the facts. It is not commentary from the sidelines. It's a set of instructions that your body is, right now, quietly carrying out. Your hormones are reading it, your heart rate is reading it. Somewhere in your bloodstream, cells are adjusting what they're doing based on a conclusion you reached about what your life means, possibly years ago, possibly before you were old enough to know you were reaching it. That's a heavy thought. But it's also, I think, the most hopeful thing in this entire body of research, because a story that was written can be revised, not easily and not by force and not by pasting a cheerful lie over a hard truth, but it can be worked on. And unlike your genes and unlike your childhood and unlike a great deal of what has happened to you, it is one of the few places where the pen is genuinely in your hand, not the whole pen, but your hand is on it. That's the stride from meaning towards something you can actually use. Thanks for walking it with me. I'm Esther Adams. This has been Strides to Solutions, and I'll see you next time.